I'm going to just speak a bit informally about my work and engagement within arts research and academia, as well as some of my organizing work in relationship to the kinds of ethical and political imperatives that we've been hearing about. I think in the first part of the conference, although it was earlier than I was able to join you, so I wasn't able to participate in that, but I look forward to making some of the connections. So my recent project has been very much an attempt to think with contemporary practices in relation to the catastrophic presence of what some are calling the Anthropocene convergence, or the racial capitalocene, but the kind of apocalyptic futurity that we face in relationship to environmental breakdown. And my recent book, Beyond the World's End, is an attempt to think through this with a range of different artists and practitioners that are also considering this within different media, from the work, for instance, of forensic architecture and Teddy Cruz and Fona Foreman in California, Arthur Jafa and Martine Sims in relation to traditions of Afrofuturism, indigenous activists and water and land protectors, including those at Standing Rock, who are also confronting the catastrophic present, but also thinking through the endings of worlds that have already taken place over the last 500 years of colonial capitalism. The work of Angela Melitopoulos in relation to extractivism in Greece, Alora and Calzadilla in Puerto Rico, Ursula Biman, and many others as well. So this is part of a larger engagement that I've been pursuing, including in relation to the Center for Creative Ecologies that I set up at University of California in Santa Cruz, where I moved from London in 2015. You can check out the website and subscribe to our quarterly newsletter to learn more about the project. But the Center for Creative Ecologies is an attempt to engage the intersections within environmental arts and humanities research, and thinking in relation to activism and civil society organizing, as well as political ecology and speculative environmentalism more broadly. And we've been pursuing a research project in the last couple of years in direct relationship to this concern of how to consider the ending of worlds, and what might life look like beyond a future of dystopian catastrophism or apocalypse, and how can we think about the ends and the ending of worlds in relationship to past endings and past worlds, specifically those that have to do with again, colonization of the Americas beginning in 1492. I like this proposition from a member of the indigenous organization, the Red Nation, Melanie Yazzie, who said that climate justice really begins in 1492, as well as the history of transatlantic slavery and the ending of worlds that have occurred owing to those conditions of racial capitalism. So we've been proposing this as part of a large-scale research project dedicated to thinking about beyond the end of the world, what comes after apocalyptic conditions of climate breakdown, as well as how can we cultivate futures of social justice and ecological flourishing. This has included a lecture series. Most recently, just a couple of days ago, we had Jonas Stahl join us and speak about his practice. It's also included art exhibitions, film screening series, and PhD research projects. We've had a wide range of speakers. There's been, in some ways, a focus on North America, but we have tried to open it up to international concerns as well. You can see a range of the speakers that we've invited. from Amin Hussein and Natasha Dillon of Decolonize This Place. They're involved right now in a current action in relationship to the Museum of Modern Art in New York that is attempting to hold that museum accountable for a history of basically its participation and complicity in fossil capitalism that has been one of the central causalities behind the current climate crisis, as well as Nick Estes and Melanie Yazzie of the Red Nation. We've had Jody Dean, Rashida Phillips and Kame Ayewa of Black Quantum Futurism. This is also related to our participation with the Center for Creative Ecologies in Manifesta 13 in Marseille that took place over the last couple of years, interrupted by the pandemic. But we were able to present some work by a couple of members of the center who are also practicing artists, Isabel Carbonell and Hannah Mazaros Martin, who's also a member of Forensic Architecture. And this also included a film screening series and with a range of presentations, some of which you can find traces of within the archive online. But this is part of what we're attempting to do within the Center for Creative Ecologies. Thinking about ecology in the expanded sense, where it's not simply about transformations in the biogeophysical realm, but also how to create a network of social connectivity that is interdisciplinary, transsectoral, and operating between art and as activism and politics, as well as the sciences more broadly. So how can we give rise to and institute different forms of creative practices that actually move beyond the institutional barriers of disciplinarity in thinking about terms like climate, environment, and ecology in a much more expansive way? So for me, I've tried to develop a methodological approach that we might call ecology as intersectionality, where ecology itself is a science of connectivity, not only between an organism and its environment, but also more broadly thinking about the Anthropocene and Capitalocene, between different approaches to nature and earth sciences, as well as the humanities and social sciences, as well as between art and politics more broadly. So I'll talk a little bit more about this and how it enters into specific practices that I'm currently focused on these days, including my own engagement in forms of activism and organizing. So some more examples of our practice that related to the Beyond the World's End research project of the Center for Creative Ecologies. This example being from the Museum of Art and History, where we mounted a small exhibition that was extended throughout the pandemic and just came down a couple of weeks ago. So recently I've been increasingly focusing on thinking about futurity, and this builds on the basis of the book Beyond the World's End. Like, how can we escape from the sense of climate realism or environmental fatalism, where we've moved away from the politics of mitigation, trying to stop the causality of climate breakdown, and move increasingly toward adaptation, which is happening in large-scale, I think, climate conference events like the UN and COP26, which is approaching in Glasgow in November of this year, as well as more broadly in nation-state approaches to the climate challenges of the present. So in many ways, this resonates with what we might call capitalist realism, which was analyzed really provocatively by Mark Fisher in the UK, which is basically a proposition that capitalism has its own temporality that tends to dominate us, such that we can't even mobilize speculative imagination for thinking about a future that would be different from the present. Instead, we're trapped within a capitalist chronopolitics where time itself has been colonized. Our future has been colonized. And what we can only live with is an infinite extension of the terms of of capitalist realism into infinitude and now into also outer space. And you see this within the cases of billionaire techno-libertarian approaches to climate problems, the kind that we see with the billionaire CEOs like the Amazon CEO, Jeff Bezos, or Elon Musk of Tesla. And their visions and well-resourced science projects to try to reach Mars and terraform or colonize the planet, or engage in different forms of space colonization in relation to asteroid mining and or space colonies and the like. So these are further examples of forms of capitalist realism that extend the post-historical approach to temporality into the distant future. So along with lots of other practitioners, I think it's increasingly important to challenge the terms of this kind of end game. People like Bifo, others like the artistic practitioners that I'm interested in are engaged with this kind of chronopolitical thinking, the insistence on politicizing time and decolonizing the future, or grasping onto emancipatory worlds to come that could foreground things like solidarity and ecological flourishing, multi-species justice, as well as social justice. So this is a current research and book project that I'm working on right now, and I'd like to share a few more details about this. So the project is based on the idea that futurity, at least a form of socially just futurity, can only be imagined on the basis of the tradition of the oppressed. This is a terminology that goes back to the work of Walter Benjamin, who used this phrasing at the end of his life when he was himself facing the Nazi Holocaust and the catastrophe of the 1940s, which is in some ways an analog for the kinds of spread of totalitarian right-wing populism and emergent eco-fascisms that we face today. That's not to say that there's any equivalence between the Nazi Holocaust and our present conjuncture. Nonetheless, there are lines of continuity that I think are really interesting, but I'm not going to get into right now so much as to talk about the critical and radical methodology that I'm using in terms of approaching futurity. So examples of this could be found within the work of indigenous and radical and Black artists and filmmakers, such as Thurza Jean Cuthand, who's an indigenous filmmaker from the Canadian context. She's based in Toronto, and she did this film called Reclamation in 2018, which is really amazing. I strongly encourage people to check it out. You can find it online; it's freely available, and it's based on the premise of what happens in the near future when basically white settler colonial people evacuate Earth owing to the growing terms of the climate crisis, and move to Mars, where they begin a new kind of colonial extractive paradigm. And the film looks at the people who are left over on Earth. In other words, indigenous peoples who are finally faced with the possibilities of reclaiming the land and decolonizing social relations in the wake of capitalist ruins. For me, just quickly, this is a really poignant approach to the critical methodology of how to define radical. Radical not only in the sense of the kinds of etymology of biology, of the root, of going to the roots of things in terms of the rhizomes and mycelial networks of the underground territories of critters and multi-species beings in the mud, but also radical in terms of that which is politically and economically disruptive in terms of the structure, the foundational conditions of our reality. And so the traditions of the oppressed, as Benjamin argued, was an attempt to locate the transformative agency of futurity itself. How can we intervene, in other words, in temporality, escaping and challenging the conditions of capitalist realism in order to invent a different kind of world to come? Well, we can only do so, I think, on the basis of histories of the oppressed and those who have suffered and challenged the violences that are both entangled within environmental violence, such as the violence of colonialism and racial capitalism, and are challenging those conditions in the present. So the tradition of the oppressed is one and really fundamental methodological approach to how I'm thinking about creative and radical futurity. Another example is the practice of Black quantum futurism, which is engaged with also an approach to chronopolitics against capitalist realism. And they're drawing on Afro-diasporic traditions in order to challenge conditions of the brutality of racial and colonial capitalism in the present. Forensic architecture is another example of this, challenging, as with their work Triple Chaser, the terms of technogenic futurity and eco-fascist climate control. So technogenic futurity has to do with the increased movement toward automation and forms of cybernetic algorithmic predictions. So this is, I think, a zone of conflict increasingly in the political struggle to reclaim our relationship to time itself. When AI is attempting to colonize the near future, this is a serious challenge and to dominating social relations in the present. So I see the work of forensic architecture, at least in terms of Triple Chaser, which is this exploration of tear gas and the production, how it relates to cultural institutions like the Whitney Museum in New York, as a really impressive case study. Another example of this is Jonas Stahl and his work trying to organize collectivities themselves, different kinds of collaborative artistic organizations, but scale them up and provide the infrastructure and the agitprop design approach to try to create connections between different organizations working locally in different geographies. So what would this entail in terms of developing forms of solidarity, but also what we might call cosmopolitical diplomacy? How can we mediate and negotiate between different radical conceptions of chronopolitics? And finally, I'm looking at artistic practices and activist challenges to the continuation of colonial relations, particularly in this context in terms of the relation to Puerto Rico and what's happening there in the wake of extreme weather events and hurricanes that have been disastrous for the island, but also the kind of financial and economic domination that has to do with long histories of US-based colonization of the island, and how grassroots organizations are resisting this in relationship, in this case, to feminism that's trying to challenge the terms of heteropatriarchy, but also how to connect environmental struggles for multi-species justice with social struggles against the conditions of extractive capitalism. That's what I'm really interested in bringing together. I see tremendous urgency there. If we're ever going to get to a point beyond the disasters of the Anthropocene, we're going to have to deal with our social, political, and economic and technological structures, so that we can only think these together with the environmental and climatological challenges. Just a few more examples before I stop. The Green New Deal is a really important paradigm shift in policymaking. I think this is very promising, but it can't be simply a top-down approach to a technocratic solution, even if it's proposed by really interesting and potentially radical political figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the States. But when we can think of pairing it with approaches to indigenous decolonization and Black abolition, then it becomes really interesting. So the Red Nation is one organization that's proposing a really, I think, important political and social approach to decolonization that is also about reclaiming and healing our planet. And I think this is exactly the kind of intersectionalist or entanglement of the social, political, economic, and the environmental that we need to be thinking about. So the Red Deal is their approach. It's meant to complement and to add on to the Green New Deal. We've dealt with this in Santa Cruz about how to take large-scale national or international programs for environmental paradigm shifts and thinking about how we can localize it and work on it within our immediate environment. And so we've considered doing that in Santa Cruz in relationship to the Democratic Socialists of America, of which I'm a member, and proposing what the Green New Deal would mean in relationship to local politics. I find increasingly, just again, methodologically, that this is really crucial. We can't just think globally in terms of these large-scale narratives like the Anthropocene without also considering what this means very locally. So for us, this has meant proposing a range of different kinds of practices, including walking and rediscovering and learning about the socio-biological conditions of our region. So we've engaged in these abolition ecology walking tours where we're trying to abolish the conditions of the corporate and security and police domination of our environments in different ways. So abolition is related to the struggle against policing in the States. And this is at the forefront of environmental activism. For us, we're following the work of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who says abolition has to be green. It has to take seriously the problem of environmental harm, but also against environmental racism and environmental degradation. To be green, it has to be red. It has to figure out ways to generalize the resources needed for well-being for the most vulnerable people in our community, which then will extend to all people. So these are some of the practices that we're engaged with. Finally, we're looking at taking back privatized investor-owned energy companies like PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric. It's the basis for energy provisions in California, and it's typical of privatized large-scale energy companies in the States, but also internationally. How can we think of transforming these companies so that they're worker-owned and we can take them back for a different kind of futurity that moves beyond petrocapitalism based on the radical possibilities of a Green New Deal coupled with a decolonial Red Deal? So I think I should stop, but look forward to talking about this in the discussion. Finally, the Progressive International is a really interesting proposal for how to, again, scale up and join these different forces on a global level. So this is the challenge, I think, for how to think about creative and radical futures. Thank you very much.